Hello Internet! So it's quite evident what this video is about. Feel free to download my slides in the link in the description. I'm making this video because I'm fascinated by this research and there aren't many comprehensive videos on the internet about the networks yet. So to give context to your already dwindling attention spans, why might you find this topic interesting? Well, most people don't know much about their minds apart from how it feels to be a mind, and it can be incredibly beneficial to know about your mind and how it works, how the machine operates, so to speak. So if you're an academic, you might learn a few new things in this video, especially toward the end of the video. If you're a uni student or just someone fascinated by the science of life like I am, then be prepared to have your mind blown by what you are. So here's a full list of the brain networks, and here is what we will be focusing on today. So I'm choosing these networks because they're the most well researched and also because they pertain the most to who we are as humans and what we do. So the agenda for this video is thus: for each network I'll be giving the known correlated areas of the brain, the clinical significance, i.e. its correlation to mental disorders, some of the changes in everyday function, structural connectivity to other networks, changes in meditation and psychoactive substance use, and with the default mode network, which is probably the most widely researched and theorized about, I will be talking about the psychoanalytic conception of self and the philosophy of consciousness. At the end, I will also be talking about potential future research potentials with this scientific knowledge, including hypothetical technologies and rehabilitation of psychopathologies. Now, how do we know about these networks? In simple terms, it comes from functional magnetic resonance imaging scans of brains that are undergoing a task or at rest and looking at the corresponding fields of localized neuronal activity with groups or networks in the brain. So our first network of interest is the Salience network, SN for short, sometimes called the ventral attention network. So its location is primarily in the midbrain, the anterior insular cortex, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, and the Brodmann's areas 24, 32, 33. It is involved in detecting and filtering salient stimuli, so what is salient to us, what we find interesting, what we attune our awareness to. So together with other brain networks, the Salience network contributes to communication, social behavior, social awareness, integration of sensory, emotional, and cognitive information, attention shifting, and it also helps us stop daydreaming so that we can focus on the task at hand. So before I talk about the clinical significance, I have to mention the triple network model. And this is basically the idea that the Salience network is like a switching station for the default mode network and the central executive. So internal, external switch, basically. And I'll mention more on that soon. But what, you ask, is the clinical significance? So dysfunction in the Salience network has been observed in people with anxiety, PTSD, schizophrenia, and others. And there's considerable evidence to suggest that psychotic symptoms are also the result of abnormal salience attribution. So a disordered way of paying attention to the world and ascribing importance to some things and not others. So the anterior insular node of the Salience network was observed to be hyperactive in people with anxiety disorders. And in schizophrenia, both structural and functional abnormalities have been observed, and therefore excessive salience being ascribed to internally generated stimuli. So for people with ADHD, it's hypothesized that there are stronger interactions between the Salience network and the default mode network, but weaker interactions with the Salience network and the central executive network. So they're deficient in ability of the Salience network to adaptively switch between the CEN and the DMN. So damage to the Salience network should, hypothetically, disrupt the regulation of associated networks. And we do see that. So inhibitory control is usually associated with rapid deactivation within parts of the DMN. And TBI patients showed a failure of DMN deactivation. So there were also alterations in people's default mode network and Salience networks who were suicidal or non-suicidal self-injurious. So just quickly, I thought it'd be really cool to show you guys what brain mapping actually looks like. This study mapped inter and intra-network connectivity in the Salience network. It really is incredible, this research. To think we are mapping how we function is just crazy. I think in the future we'll see these types of images form in a database with all the usual connectivity and function mapped for some virtuous or even vicious purpose. And given the more we learn about the brain through AI, psychology, philosophy, the more those disciplines will naturally become more integrated, to the point where we may even be able to predict behaviors, program individuals, induce pleasant experiences, and also a powerful tool for psychotronic warfare, which is startling to think about. So one thing that's important to note is the Salience network is inversely correlated to the default mode network. So the Salience network I mentioned before is thought to be a switch between activating and deactivating the DMN and the CEN. And ultimately that comes from the way we pay attention to things, what we deem as important, ascribing context to things. I'm lying down in a bed, there is nothing that is demanded of me in this time, or I'm in a large group of people and I have some virtuous enterprise to do somewhere which demands of me some facilities of language, etc. And the other point here to note is that the insular cortex, one of the main parts of the Salience network, is responsible for compassion, empathy, self-awareness, and Antonio Damasio, author of the great book Descartes' Error, proposed that it plays a role in mapping visceral states that are associated with emotional experience. So this is a really interesting point for hypothetical rehabilitation of psychopathological people, which I'll come to at the end of the video. Now, what is the effect of mindfulness and psychoactive substances on the Salience network? So in mindfulness-based practices, researchers found increased or enhanced functional connectivity between the default mode network and the Salience network. So what is functional connectivity? First, let's look at structural connectivity, the physical connections between brain regions. Now, functional connectivity is the statistical dependence between spatially distinct neurophysiological signals. So how likely it is that the neuronal excitations in one network may send signals or become correlated to another network. And, how well they're connecting with each other, sending information back and forth and such. Coming back to the Salience network and mindfulness, researchers found this increased connectivity because of the participants' ability to attend to current experience without judgment, and this is something which I'll come back to later. It's called decentering. But for cannabis, it was actually found to reduce functional connectivity between the Salience network and the default mode network. Remember that the Salience network is responsible for what we pay attention to, what we ascribe meaning to or find interesting, and the default mode network is activated during daydreaming when we don't have any tasks to do. So what this decrease in functional connectivity between the Salience network and DMN means under the influence of THC is that there is increased ability for the mind to wander, while also at the same time having some attributes of the central executive network still intact, so reasoning faculties and such, as well as an altered sense of what we find interesting and meaningful and what we basically attend our awareness to, what we're picking up from the external environment, and we do see that in terms of its effect. Now, for those that don't know, there's actually two compounds found in cannabis. The first is THC, which is psychoactive. The second is CBD. It's not psychoactive, so it doesn't get you high. It has anti-inflammatory properties. It's an anxiolytic, so reduces anxiety. It's also a CB1 allosteric modulator. I really find it interesting what that is, but I don't have time to go into it in this video. But the most interesting thing about it is that there's actually evidence to suggest it's neuroprotective in combination with THC. So it reduces the memory impairments associated with THC and also reduces how much functional connectivity is lost because of THC. So from the slide before, we saw that ADHD individuals had stronger interactions between the Salience network and the DMN and weaker interactions between the Salience network and the CEN. So with THC, there were actually improvements to attention and awareness in individuals with ADHD, and that result is kind of counterintuitive considering that ADHD individuals have stronger interactions in the Salience network and the DMN. So that could be a potential future research project. as well as seeing whether overall THC in combination with CBD could be used as a drug for curbing attentional deficits, even despite some evidence to suggest that it does have a detrimental effect on memory and to some degree intelligence long term. Now time for psychedelics. So many classic serotonergic psychedelics like psilocybin work on the 5-HT2A receptor. It's important to note here that the density of 5-HT2A receptors is very high in cortical midline hubs of the Salience network and the default mode network. So when people take psychedelics, we're going to see a lot of activity there basically. And electrical activity in those networks are altered due to the way this neurochemical operates in the synapse and changes electrical potentials after depolarization at the synaptic junction. Just some qualitative data here on the experience itself to put things into context, of course. There was a psychological questionnaire given to participants at the end of 14 months after the experience. This is called the Mystical Experience Survey. I've left the link in the description below. 58 and 67% of participants rated psilocybin occasion experience as among the 5 most personally meaningful and among the 5 most spiritually significant experiences of their lives. 64% indicated that the experience increased well-being or life satisfaction. 58% met criteria for having had a complete mystical experience. And as some of you may be wondering, what's the reliability of this questionnaire? Well, so a study reviewed this and found that it was quite reliable. Other character effects from psychedelics include more empathy, connection to the environment, and connection to other people. So these are some really interesting results in terms of what altering Salience network activity can offer a human individual in liberating them from such things as depression, anxiety, trauma, all due to increased functional connectivity between those brain networks. Visualizing now functional connectivity with psilocybin. So in the top left is the placebo group, and the top right is the psilocybin group. So in blue we have the activity of the Salience network measured as a relative bold signal, which we talked about earlier. We can see in the placebo group in the top left, the DMN in red is far out of sync with the Salience network in blue. And on the right, in the psilocybin group, we see far more synchronicity in fluctuation. Now, it's important to read this chart correctly, given that both networks are inversely correlated. You might think that as red goes up, blue should go down, right? But remember, this study is measuring functional connectivity. So if blue and red match more together, then it means there is better communication going on between those networks and not so out of sync. Now, this research is all well and good as research, but what is it explaining exactly? And what does it mean in a broader context of self and how we put our worlds and beliefs together? I mean, what good is neuroscientific research unless we apply it to other disciplines like psychology and philosophy, right? So some of the authors of this research, Carhart and Friston in 2019, suggest that the DMN and the SN encode for a self model that is hierarchical and predictive in nature. So building our conception of ourselves from hierarchies of data that is predictive in nature. And they discovered a person's beliefs were in many ways associated within midline hubs of the SN and the DMN. And so in waking cognition, they provide a kind of probabilistic inference of what reality and self are. So this hierarchical self-model is thought to be something that binds information from the outside world, integrates it in many different ways and modalities, and posits a sense of self. Now, there is contention already in philosophy and neuroscience whether free will or self or ego actually exists, and one of, if not the oldest religion in Hinduism, and then Buddhism, some 100 or 1,000 years later, have at the core of their sage mystical insights that it doesn't. That we're all one consciousness in delusion, dancing a play of some kind. So Dr. Chris Letheby, in his book of Philosophy of Psychedelics, notes that these modulations to the SN and the DMN implicate changes to sense of self because they are both independently plausible neural substrates of self-representation, or at least minimal forms of self-representation. We'll come back to this in the default mode network section. Lastly, there is talk of something called the reset theory, and it suggests that sometimes both networks get caught in rigid and dysfunctional configurations. Psychedelics then help modulate these networks through increased connectivity, through imposing what is known as disorder or entropy, and through this disorder there is a kind of therapeutic potential for those inflexible pathological configurations to be released, and therefore reevaluations of self to occur. So now on to the task positive network. Sometimes this network is called the dorsal attention network. Its location is the intraparietal sulcus, the frontal eye fields, and Brodmann areas 7 and 8. So it's most prominently involved in goal-directed voluntary control of visuospatial attention and is active during attention-demanding tasks. And that includes our conscious attention towards the external environment. And the clinical significance, we see reduced connectivity within the dorsal and ventral attention networks in ADHD, and similarly connectivity between the TPN and the frontal parietal network is associated with major depressive disorder. Overactivation of the TPN has been observed in patients with schizophrenia. So this is just a quick look at where the task positive network orients itself within the brain. And this image here actually shows the task positive network in yellow and the Salience network in blue, so that's quite easy to visualize there. So as mentioned before, in the Salience network being a switch between other networks, the interaction between the task positive network and the ventral attention network, i.e. the Salience network, enables dynamic control of attention in relation to top-down goals and bottom-up sensory stimulation. What is top-down goals and bottom-up sensory stimulation? It is basically just how we integrate information above different layers of abstraction. And we can see that in the top left image, which I don't have time to go into, but a useful analogy can be drawn to maybe economics on the right. So we know the Salience network is the switch between the default mode network and the task positive network, and we also see similar results in the Salience network with psychedelics, increased functional connectivity between the default mode network and the task positive network after psilocybin, and interesting to note as well that the same functional connectivity was found in psychosis and states of meditation. There are phenomenological similarities between the psychedelic state and the meditation state, and it's proposed that the DMN-TPN functional connectivity is related to the separateness of internally and externally driven focus states. The image in the bottom left is a computer-generated representation of the increased functional connectivity under the influence of psilocybin and after. Here is that same image again, showing the functional connectivity of the TPN and DMN under psilocybin. This is in the bottom image. Now onto the central executive network, sometimes called the frontal parietal network, FPN, or CEN for short. So its location is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, especially the middle frontal gyrus, the anterior inferior parietal lobe, Brodmann areas 9, 39, 40, 46. So it's crucial for rule-based problem solving, actively maintaining and manipulating information in working memory and making decisions in the context of goal-oriented behavior. It's important in emotional regulation or cognitively demanding tasks, sustained attention, and working memory especially. So similar to the task positive network, the DMN and the CEN have a negative correlation with one another, so they're not enemies, they just have inverse relationships. So when the DMN is most active, the CEN quietens down, and when it's time for the CEN to be active, the DMN calms down. And so we can see in this image here that the Salience network is a dynamic switcher between the two, between self-referential mental activity, being the default mode network, and cognitively demanding mental activity, which is the central executive network. I couldn't find much research on the central executive network compared to the default mode and Salience networks, but it is quite self-explanatory what its functions are. With respect to meditation, we see increased functional connectivity, and psychedelics, increased functional connectivity between the default mode and central executive. So psychedelics have also been shown to alter the integrity of and coupling between the executive control network to other networks. Now onto the default mode network, which is the most fascinating network in my opinion. Its location is the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, the angular gyrus, the inferior parietal lobe, and it has a lot of connection to the thalamus too. The Brodmann areas are 12, 25, 32, 33, 24, 23, and 31. It is active when a person is not focused on the outside world and is at wakeful rest, daydreaming, mind-wandering, thinking about others, themselves, the past, planning for the future, or even during detailed thoughts related to external task performance. It's also involved in conception of self and internal goal-orientated and conceptual cognitive tasks. So its relation to other networks, similar to the TPN, the DMN and the CEN have a negative correlation. So we know already that it's related to other networks and it's involved in switching depending on what the external environment is asking of us. One thing that's really interesting about this network compared to others is that it can be broken down into two different subsystems, the dorsal medial subsystem and the medial subsystem. So the first is the thinking about others system, so involved in socially directed thought, determining the purpose of another's actions, beliefs about others, retrieval of social semantic and conceptual knowledge, and abstract conceptual information, particularly social in nature. The medial subsystem is related to autobiographical memory and future simulations. So it's the formation of new memories as well as remembering the past and imagining the future, spatial scene recognition and simulation, spatial navigation, and junction of auditory, visual, and somatosensory information and attention. So what's really interesting about this network is that it's potentially one of the neurological bases for the self in terms of, your own memories, self-reference, so your understanding of your traits and descriptions of yourself, and emotions of oneself as well, reflecting on your own emotional state. The other interesting thing about it is that it relates to thinking about others, so the theory of mind, thinking about the thoughts of others and what they might think or know, the emotions of the other person, so your empathy from them, so conceptually the ability to feel empathy, and moral reasoning as well, determining a just from an unjust result of an action, social evaluations as well, good or bad attitudes, judgments about social concepts, and social categorization too, so reflecting on important social characteristics and where we place certain actions or certain individuals in certain groups. And social isolation, a perceived lack of social interaction. So it's also implicated in remembering the past and thinking about the future, so recalling events that happened to you, imagining the future, episodic memory, things that happened in the past and how they may relate to the future, as well as story comprehension, so understanding and remembering a narrative and how that may apply to you individually. And then replay, consolidating recently acquired memory traces and integrating that back into a storyline. So the clinical significance of the default mode network is it's hypothesized to be relevant to many disorders, including Alzheimer's, autism, schizophrenia, major depressive disorder, and chronic pain. It's reported to show overlapping yet distinct neural activity patterns across different mental health conditions as well. So that's really interesting to note because many disorders have the same dysfunction within the DMN. And researchers know that from comparing results within the DMN with individuals with ADHD and autism and other disorders. So its connection to the thalamus is really strong, and the thalamus itself is like a relay station for all incoming sensory input. It's one of the first developed areas of the brain, some hundreds of millions of years ago probably, and it allows hub-like exchanges of information with brain networks. So the thalamus has a really high importance in terms of value of node degree and centrality in the DMN. So what does that mean? So here's a really interesting graph of the structural connectivity of the default mode network, and we can see that node size represents node degree. So the size of the circles represent how many nodes of neurons there are. So we can think of nodes like bundles or connections of neurons used within a network. And the color is represented as being on a scale of centrality, so how close or far apart they are to one another or how central they are to one another. And we can see how interconnected this network is, all the way from the ventromedial prefrontal cortex to the posterior cingulate cortex in yellow at the back, and its connection to the thalamus as well. Wow, just look at that. It really is incredible, this research. Again, to think we're mapping how we function is just insane. We really do live in a science fiction, don't we? Another similar graph here showing the strength of the connections, and we see that the posterior parietal cortex on the right has high density of connection to the dorsal prefrontal cortex on the left, as well as all those other connections. So this image was taken from a study that measured the development of the default mode network over time, so from 8 years old to 13 years old to 25 years old, and we see how it changes its structure over time. So it was shown in children that the regions are largely local and organised by their physical location. The frontal regions are highlighted in blue. And in adults, the networks became highly correlated despite their physical distance. So greater connection over larger distances. It's important to note that there was some scrutiny over this paper because of younger subjects' disposition to move more during image acquisition. So a look into the real-life operation of the default mode network. How is it changing in normal everyday life? With antidepressant use, abnormalities in the DMN connectivity was shown to be reduced following treatment. In sleep deprivation, the functional connectivity between nodes of the DMN in their resting state is usually stronger, but sleep deprivation results in a decrease in connectivity with the DMN, and that may explain some of the cognitive symptoms we may feel when we haven't got enough rest. So recent studies also suggest a decrease in connectivity between the DMN and the TPN as a result of sleep loss too. So task-positive network, reduced ability to stay on task, that explains that. Physical activity was postulated that it may alter the DMN. Acupuncture, there was a deactivation of the limbic brain areas in the DMN, and it was suggested that this was due to the pain response. So attention training techniques like meditation, it shows that a single session of attention training changes functional connectivity of the DMN, so very similar results to the fMRI studies on meditators. With deep brain stimulation, it was seen that it could be used to balance resting state networks, which is quite an interesting finding. And in psychotherapy, individuals with PTSD saw abnormalities in the default mode network normalize in individuals who respond to psychotherapy interventions, and not everyone does. It's important to know that. On to sleep, meditation, and psychedelics. So in sleeping and resting wakefulness, we see that during the onset of sleep, there is a decrease in connectivity between the default mode and the task-positive network. And then during REM sleep, so dreaming, there's a possible increase in connectivity between the nodes of the DMN. And then in resting wakefulness, the connectivity between the nodes of the DMN is very strong. Then in stage N2 of REM sleep, decrease in functional connectivity between the posterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex. And then in stage 3 of REM sleep, further decrease in connectivity between the posterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex. In meditation, there were found to be structural changes in areas of the DMN, as we know already. There was also reduced activation and reduced functional connectivity of the DMN in long-term practitioners. Various forms of non-directive meditation, including transcendental meditation, have been found to activate the DMN. So similar results were found with psychedelic drugs, reduced blood flow to the posterior cingulate cortex and medial prefrontal cortex. And also one study on the effects of LSD demonstrated that it desynchronizes brain activity within the DMN. So from this we can see psychedelics and meditation are shown to deactivate and activate the same areas of the brain. And they have a very similar effect, only one without a visual stimuli from the 5-HT2A receptors in the occipital cortex. Now this is a really interesting finding that has a lot of implications, and I will talk about that soon. So I just wanted to put some of this into context for you guys, because some of it by now might be going over your heads a little. So as you read through this, just know that the LPFC stands for lateral prefrontal cortex, which is the director for activating the TPN, and ACC stands for anterior cingulate cortex, and that's the attender. So voluntary switching here is possible to do with experience in awareness training, such as meditation. And meditators were also found to have increases in the size of the brain correlated to these networks. So because of synaptic plasticity, the ability for the brain to keep growing through making new connections, you can increase areas in your brain just by practicing meditation. So just recapping some of that research again, we know that psilocybin is a classic psychedelic and a good candidate for the drug model of psychosis, and we see that through increased functional connectivity between the DMN and the TPN. The same functional connectivity was observed in psychosis and states of meditation, as well as sedation too. And another point here is that ketamine, a horse tranquilizer, was found to disrupt the frontal control of the DMN, so disconnects the medial prefrontal cortex and the subgenual cortex from the DMN for a period of time and allows other parts of the brain to take over resting thought. So just to visualize some of the data we've seen so far, in the top left we see the post-placebo group, and the coupling strength is lower than the post-psilocybin group, coupling strength being connectivity to other networks. And then on the right image, we see the individuals who took psilocybin. We saw the coupling strength within those networks were decreased before and then increased after. Similarly, we found increased connection to the thalamus in the top left, with post-placebo being lower than post-psilo. That was also found with the thalamus to task-positive network connection as well. So I want to get into some of the psychological characteristics of the effects of alterations to the connectivity within the DMN. And it was seen after psilocybin administration that cortisol levels spiked, and then the associated activation of the executive control network, and then diminishing of the DMN because they're anti-correlated. And following this, there was a subsequent increased control over emotional processes and relief of negative thinking and persistent negative emotions. So then after 2 months and 14 months after the experience, they were rated on trait openness, cognitive behavioral flexibility, and positive attitude and mood, as well as social effects and behaviors. And they all rated very high on those, as well as a decrease in depressive symptoms in terminally ill cancer patients. One double-blind study even reported persistent positive changes in attitude and behavior after a single dose for up to 25 years. So these findings suggest that psilocybin might be a valuable compound for the treatment of psychiatric conditions. And the efficacy of psilocybin in alcohol dependence showed a significant reduction with large effect sizes. Tobacco dependency saw 80% of the participants had quit smoking after 6 months. And the most common reasons they gave were changing orientation toward the future so that long-term benefits outweighed the immediate desires. That was 73%. And strengthening participants' beliefs in their ability to quit, 73%. And changing life priorities and values such that smoking was no longer more important than quitting, 68%. Similarly, one study in this year, 2022, found MDMA or ecstasy use and psilocybin use were associated with lower odds of psychological distress and suicidal thoughts in a sample of US adults. So there's also some research to say that meditation can enhance the beneficial effects of psychedelic administration. 2 high-dose psilocybin experience gave higher support in meditation and showed greater psychological benefits from mystical type experiences. So this concept of decentering is the key mindfulness skill that involves disidentifying with thoughts and feelings and seeing them as mere thoughts and feelings as representations in the mind rather than as a reality itself. So the thoughts of I am hopeless, I am unworthy, they recognize it as just a thought, a representation of the world that could be wrong. In this experience, recognizing representations as representations is called phenomenal opacity in philosophy. So from Dr. Lethaby's book, Philosophy of Psychedelics, published by Oxford University Press, he suggested that psychedelics do the same thing but from the other direction. So while mindfulness ultimately causes one's self-model to collapse by gradually chipping away at it, decentering, psychedelics induce decentering by directly disrupting the neural substrates of the self-model. And by disrupting the functioning of the default mode and salience networks, psychedelics induce experiences in which a sense of self dissolves, or its boundaries become weakened and blurred. When psychedelics disrupt self-modeling, they stop us identifying with all the things, including stories, narratives, thoughts, feelings, and perspectives we usually identify with. These mental concepts don't necessarily go away, but they are no longer experienced as me, so they can be viewed with more distance, spaciousness, detachment, objectivity, clarity, and humor. It's really important to note that it's not a cure-all magic bullet. Some people can compartmentalize their learnings into something called a spiritual ego, a grandiose fabrication of self that is esteemed because of its newfound understanding and connection to the world and phenomenal opacity, and also that it does not guarantee immunity from risk or detriment. While it's very safe in controlled environments with professionals, some individuals may be more at risk than others due to sensitivity of mind or even latent psychosis. Now on to the researchers' psychological hypothesis from their research. So in 2010, Carhart, Harris and Friston provided neuropsychoanalytic account of what's going on here. They postulated that the DMN was an orchestra conductor or a corporate executive of the brain, preventing signals from being interrupted or interfering with each other. And they also believe the DMN may have been an evolutionary mechanism, as it doesn't become active until later in a child's development, typically around age 5. Their hypothesis was that as we mature, we tend to use life's learnings to create algorithms in order to respond to various situations throughout the day. And so our perception of reality is filtered through these habitual connections that become increasingly ingrained as we grow older. In 2018, Dimitrov offered an analysis of that paper, and he saw that the central executive network and the Salience network were to be viewed as the true representatives of Freudian ego. And his hypothesis criticized Carl Harris and Friston's postulation of the default mode network being the brain representative of Freudian ego. So research is still unclear on how much the Freudian ego exists within the DMN exclusively, yet psychedelics reveal truth to the magnitude the default mode network plays in the construction of some kind of Freudian ego. But perhaps the notions of self are a problem created linguistically. So language based on the sentence composed of subject, verb, predicate contains a hidden belief system that events are started by nouns, by things. In the objective world, there are no things at all, really. It's just a kind of soup of activity going on, of all different processes all merged with each other and no distinctions at all. Contrary to the view that the universe is the sum total of all things, it's quite a shock to common sense. So this leads to an infinite regress. What is a thing? You say an object, but that's just a substituted word. And so this becomes a fallacy of abstraction and categorization that the brain makes by default for survival value, thingifying the world, as it were. So the brain needs to break down the world into units to actually understand it. But it may very well be that we mistake those bits of information for a self and for a real reality. So in philosophy, this is called the reification fallacy. And in this view, reality and self are more like a Rorschach blot, rather than a material substance or self that persists and always does, determinately. So prima facie, or on the surface, it may look to us naively like this, that the default mode network is correlated to the ego because of the feeling of self and daydreaming, etc. The CEN is correlated to the superid, i.e. rationality and morality, and the TPN is correlated to the id, goal-orientated self-serving behavior and such. But this, I don't think, is the case, given good judgment about the integrative nature of these networks. So we really don't know what consciousness is and how it arises, or how to define or quantify it. Most people have the philosophical worldviews that are overly reductive to scientific materialism and naive realism, and do not integrate interpretations of quantum mechanics, philosophy of mind, ontology, and metaphysics. And we need to start bringing that into how we conceive the idea of self with respect to this research. We need to refer to holistic attributes of systems and potential scientific ontology. So we need to appeal to systems theory in this sense. Systems theory is the interdisciplinary study of systems, i.e. cohesive groups of interrelated, interdependent components that can be natural or human-made. So a system is more than the sum of its parts by expressing synergy or emergent behavior and phenomena. Changing one component of a system may affect other components or the whole system itself. What is ontology? It's a branch of metaphysics in philosophy dealing with the nature of being, or it's a set of concepts or categories in a subject area or domain that shows their properties and the relations between them. And here we really must look at ontological dependency, so dependence on another entity if the first entity cannot exist without the second entity, and ontological independencies where entities can exist all by themselves. So why I'm saying this is because we don't know where to place the ego, whether it's in the DMN or the CEN, and what might be the case, as Dr. Letheby suggests, is that it's correlated to all of them in minimal ways, and consciousness could be seen as an independent entity, even despite some people believing it has some kind of material property. Remember, though, that material properties of neurochemical interactions are not causation, only correlation, so therefore we need an analogy. So we can think of consciousness as a liquid gas, like fuel, within a multi-combustion engine with many different types of engines, and as the fuel moves through the machine, it combusts at different temperatures, different speeds, different shapes, all rendering a different degree of energy or information. So transferring the analogy across now, consciousness requires certain patterns, frequencies, structures to emerge and become behaviors, memory, self-relation, qualia. Qualia being the immaterial nature of subjective consciousness. So this is a scientifically valid premise given the evidence of attributes of its operation neuroscientifically, And it bears relationship to philosophies informed by mathematical theorems like Tononi's Integrated Information Theory, IIT, and others like Andrew Gallimore, who is a computational neurobiologist at Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology, and he's also written a book called Alien Information Theory, which goes into what consciousness could be given the phenomenology of what the psychedelic experiences are. And then we can look at consciousness as if it's filtered into compartmentalized clusters of neurons responsible for creating different networks. And these networks have different operational values and or inherent structure to one another. The way information is interpreted in them is different, but consciousness resides within them all, i.e. remove all networks from a brain that has memory but leave intact the DMN, and this individual is still conscious. Likewise, remove all the networks from the brain but the CEN, that individual is still conscious. And so Dr. Letheby explains acute lasting modulation of the SN and DMN by psychedelics implicate changes to self-representation because the Salience network and the default mode network, independently plausible neural substrates of narrative and minimal forms of self-representation respectively. So if you've never heard of integrated information theory before, it's a theory which tries to account for the emergence of consciousness, which no one can quite understand yet properly because of the hard problem of consciousness, as Dr. Chalmers, an Australian philosopher, talks about. So integrated information theory suggests that consciousness emerges when exchanges of energy or information occur in specific ways, dynamic interactions. So it postulates that in order for consciousness to arise, it must have certain properties or attributes like intrinsic existence or composition and information exchange, as well as integration of information. And if you carry it to its conclusion, you end up somewhere near the China brain, which is a thought experiment developed by Ned Block. And it's where the entirety of China is asked to simulate the action of one neuron per individual using a telephone or walkie-talkie in order to simulate the axons and dendrites that connect neurons within a brain, and then supposedly consciousness would emerge from this due to the way information is integrated in that system. Now that is quite ridiculous to think about, but it extends the analogy quite far in terms of looking at the problems with how consciousness is emerging here, which is very relevant to brain networks and the problem of ego, which researchers are trying to figure out. So branching out here into other disciplines, and I'll admit firstly that my knowledge on quantum mechanics is only quite superficial, but yet still it's in our interests within our respective discipline to try and integrate the science within the scientific knowledge in other disciplines, to try and unify all of our disciplines for a greater purpose and therefore greater understanding. So consciousness could be then seen as a field, a force constitution within a higher spatial or temporal dimension which intersects within ours or forms ourself. In this view, some or all forms of matter, i.e. electrically charged particles, may be correlated or linked to a higher spatial temporal form, quality or attribute, be influenced by higher dimensional processes within its realm or others. And this would explain why awareness is specific to any given network itself, and it would explain emergent phenomena of consciousness from integrated feedback circuits of electrically charged particles, i.e. the brain, and cohere with mechanical philosophy, which is the view that the universe itself is a giant machine of some sort, or it could even be a form of consciousness itself. It also explains many of the religious and mystical notions of self, soul, and heaven. So ultimately this is going to be ineffable due to the limitations to our mind, but it does bear strong similarity to Plato's cave, which came some 2,500 years ago. And it does describe Plato's cave being the third dimension itself, and once we leave that cave, branch off into higher dimensions, and then return to our bondage within the third. And this is quite an old concept. This is a quote from Shakespeare here. "Heaven doth with us, as we with torches do, not light them for themselves." Consciousness here being the fire. So what is attractive about this idea then? Well, it coheres somewhat with many theories in physics, mathematics, and philosophy. Although string theory on dimensions is still being researched, it requires extra dimensions of space-time for their mathematical consistency. In bosonic string theory, there's 26 dimensions. In superstring theory, there's 10, and 11 dimensions in supergravity theory and M theory. There's also dispute among physicists which interpretation of quantum mechanics is true. So we've got the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation that consciousness itself causes the collapse of the wave function. And the authors of this ended up discovering that it does itself imply a kind of solipsism, or maybe even multi-solipsism, and that idea was abandoned. And it may be the case that Solipsism, or some form of it, does bear some truth, but we just reject the idea as preposterous because we don't really have, in a way, in our minds to understand how solipsism could be true, even despite many of our religious truths being coherent with it in some degree. The next is the many worlds interpretation, and you've got Copenhagen interpretation and superstring theory and M theory and many, many others. So the nature of consciousness and these theories probably won't be solved for a long time, so we may have to rely on inference to the best explanation, also called abductive reasoning. So there's evidence which already suggests that consciousness is involved in quantum mechanics. Sir Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff discovered quantum vibrations in microtubules inside neurons. They call this orchestrated objective reduction. They also postulated EEG rhythms, brainwaves, also derived from deeper level microtubule vibrations. So that's really, really interesting. And then researchers discovered that the brain is full of multi-dimensional geometric structures operating in as many as 11 dimensions in cliques of neurons, which disappear as soon as the brain registers information. And that does make me wonder that if higher dimensions are true, as string theory postulates, and the brain is capable of creating multidimensional structures, then could there not be an information flow from higher dimensions within to our brains, which may control our behavior or give indication or generate thoughts themselves? It's just a speculation, but it's quite an interesting one. Just to give you guys an idea on how complicated some of this stuff is, this is a chart of interpretations of quantum mechanics in their crossover of what each theorem takes to be true in its implications. I mean, this really is evidence of a very deep and complex universe here, and really shows the limitations of our mind's ability to interpret it. We may need assistance from AI very soon, that is if they don't enslave us beforehand. So now on to the potential futures of network research. Yes, fun time, future technologies. So what could we do with this sort of research, and how could we apply it to the future of humanity? So real developing technologies at the moment are Elon Musk's Neuralink, which are nano-sized brain probe inserts. And who knows, maybe one day they'll be released publicly or be an option for so-called transhumanists, which are people who already have chips inside of their bodies to pay for groceries and such. The other interesting technology here is in biotech, so nanorobots configuring neural pathways. This is also a reality, so some researchers have developed these xenobots, they call them, and they are less than 1 millimeter in length and constructed of about 500 to 1,000 living cells. They've been created in a variety of basic shapes, including some with legs. Studies have shown they can effectively move linearly and circularly, join with other xenobots to act collectively, move tiny objects, and live for around 10 days. Scientists believe they could possibly impact human, animal, and environmental health, although their status as programmable living robots made from living organic tissue raises ethical concerns. A final interesting development in nanobot research is using nanotechnology to establish a global superbrain where human thought, theoretically, could be transferred to an artificial interface, establishing a human brain cloud interface. So quite scary stuff when you think about it. I mean, amazing technologies if there are virtues flourishing in this world, but we all know that there is many vicious and malicious people out there with all sorts of agendas. So the hypothetical directions as well for this are a more discrete and focused version of gamma knifing, so microwave used in radiosurgery. And this is where targeted EMF beams could create a neural pruning effect of nets of neurons or connections within a network. So we could see this as having potential for people with schizophrenia or TBI, whereby we can reprogram certain areas of the brain with microwaves or other EMF frequencies. So it's already been known that microwaves can alter neurotransmission and frequency, and there's a list of references there from 4 to 25 if you're willing to look. We also see in studies that Wi-Fi affects stress, emotional, behavioral, and cognitive processes as well. So microwaves have been known to alter consciousness. A group of researchers tested rodents and I believe humans with Wi-Fi fields, which are microwaves, if you didn't know that, After sleeping within a Wi-Fi field, the subjects were more irritable and had more cognitive dissonance than the control group, and after many days of exposure, the behaviours became normalised. And this is already happening. We might not even know how much we're affected because we're all bathing in these fields, which alter neuron transmission to a large extent, even at the densities that we're usually exposed to. Now, this isn't to say they wouldn't be subtle, especially to the untrained mind, but who's to say how attuned most people are to the subtleties of their mind, especially without practicing meditation or awareness training techniques. And it reminds me a lot of the parable of the well of madness, where everyone thinks the king is crazy, but he's the only one who isn't drinking out of the poison well, whereby we wouldn't know the full extent of EMF on our subjectivities due to it being so widespread and the mass lack of subjective attunement to the subtle changes within their minds. Now, to be clear, I'm not postulating that this is actually going on. I'm simply giving a reference point to suggest how humans can be aware of what they might be subject to without even being aware of it yet, for the purposes of safeguarding against dystopian futures. So the core idea here is that microwave frequencies like 5G are always talked about as being carcinogenic, but really the issue here is more in terms of how it may affect cognition and what sort of psychopathologies that may lead to long term and change how those brain networks are interacting long term, how much functional connectivity is reduced with exposure. All of this sort of research has not been done yet. So, are we going into a dystopian nightmare?
Well, regardless of the answer, what kind of questions should we be asking about this as human beings in order to safeguard against the vast possibilities of control which we may be subject to with or without knowing? And those kinds of questions are asking precisely how might this technology be something else other than what we perceive it to be, especially with respect to microwave technologies and communication technologies, as well as how might it affect our consciousness in ways which we may become tuned to through habitual operation within our networks and the functional connectivity within them. So people may end up losing the ability to understand many aspects of themselves and what is going on in their world around them. And such despondency can make easy targets for entire subgroup species selection for programming without us even being aware of it. So that is something which humans may in the future likely need to address, if not already, if classified information is revealing of such details.
Let's just have a brief look at what's going on and what's possible. The fields of research currently are AI, neuroscience, nanorobotics, gene editing, and microwave weapons. So those are some very, very powerful scientific tools there. So could those technologies be utilized for vicious means within the exploitation of the economic systems we're in? So in the Western world, it's mainly capitalist democracies with an open market, and in the East, it's communist socialist dictatorships or like thereof. Now, both systems here have weaknesses to be exploited, and that creates vulnerabilities to humans. We see already that corporations and governments have the ability to classify certain information, and that obviously is a vulnerability to humans. We would think that we'd place our trust in people of positions of power, but we have to remember that that's an assumption that we give because we have no other choice, essentially, and there is something known as psychological operations as well, so it could be that researchers themselves can become corrupted through these tactics, and secret research goes on. Now, all of this is very conspiracy theorist, but it's just to give you an insight into the potentials of how this kind of technology and research could be put into the wrong hands. As the old saying goes, when the wrong man uses the right means work in the wrong way. So, some more wholesome potentials of this research on brain networks. Well, it could be used to recondition unethical minds or people with a psychopathological conditioning. And I do find this to be very fascinating and necessary for society to know of, and have written half a thesis on it already. So by reconfiguring how the Salience and default mode network interact, we could potentially reconfigure a person's understanding of ethical relationships to the world and through self with appropriately trained professionals. Now, this occurs through the altered concept of self in relation to past experiences, where we build our ethics from, essentially. As seen from psychedelics, alterations with functional connectivity of the default mode network and Salience networks cause subjects empathy to increase, reevaluate their notions of self and reality. So the methodology for psychedelic-assisted therapy requires input from philosophy with respect to accounting philosophically for altered self-conception, i.e. the many explanations of consciousness and non-ego, i.e. idealism, panpsychism, monism, dualism, individualism, materialism, and helping the patient rebuild and reevaluate human constructs of ethics and morality with respect to their mystical or revelationary experiences. And understanding and integrating those ethical and moral constructs in relation to their learned social paradigms informed by upbringing, emotional trauma, social conditioning, which are direct causes to delinquent and criminal behavior. So the prison system is obviously not the best place because a lot of those behaviors are just simply reinforced through being subject to other people with similar tendencies. So what's the prime candidate here to bring about this change? Clearly, it's the default mode network in terms of its relation to self-conception and self-narrative, and it's also the Salience network in terms of communication, social behavior, self-awareness, integration of sensory, emotional, and cognitive information, all needed to reconfigure a person's ethical relationships to themselves and the world. So from the neuroscientific research on psychedelics and meditation already discussed, brain regions and networks responsible for producing expanded awareness of self and other are orientated within the same place. We know that, the DMN and the SN. It includes deactivation of the DMN and functional connectivity with the Salience network. So this functional connectivity between the Salience network and the default mode networks provides a vantage point for understanding newfound experiences of oneself, social and behavior self-reevaluations, integration of sensory, emotional, cognitive information. So the premise here is that a person with a good conscience extracts his morality from his capacity to empathize as well as his sense of self. So in psychiatric conception, these drugs are a device upon the mind which can temporarily relieve the ego from its boundedness to the subconscious faculties of the mind, allowing for a deeper reevaluation psychologically. So this potential opportunity for subjects to reevaluate their own morality needs research due to the pressing ethical problem of the lack of rehabilitation within prisons and, moreover, the failed punitive justice systems worldwide. So I also have a video on psychedelic research and drug law change, as well as potential implications for mass use of psychedelics. So feel free to check that out. Remember that all the references are in the slides below and they're downloadable in the description section. Thank you all for listening, and I bid you farewell.